Hello and welcome to Lesson 2 of Incraft's Design Sketching Series. The plan for this drawing is to draw a World War II American soldier resting up against a blown apart house. The very first thing I start doing is creating my character's head. So a simple circle will do, and I'll start with a vertical line and a horizontal line to dictate which way will my character be looking at, or what will be his pose. Then right after that I move on to the body, drawing how I envision the legs and the arms to be positioned. So if you could think of it as a wire figure, that's more or less what I'm drawing. So I'm not relying on muscles or sinew or anything like that just yet. At a later stage I will place my character's rifle here. For now this is only a line to indicate which way it will be facing. I'll also start to add a couple more details into which position or which pose I want his arm to be. So these are the planning stages of the drawing. So I start to add a couple more details in regards to the musculature of my character as well as facial features. So if you think of it as a layering process, I first begin with an underlying structure, and then I start adding some more detail on top of that. In whatever I deem important. Right now I'm focusing on the hand. Now this is a resting pose. He's obviously had a long day's toil. We don't know what this character's gone through, so what I'm trying to convey is a sense of rest for him, a sense of just absorbing his surroundings and just taking it easy, knowing that there's no dangers lurking anywhere, at least seemingly so. So right now this is where I realize I've made a mistake, and normally no character sitting on the ground would have his foot facing straight up, or at least I don't think most characters would. Because this character is resting, I would like to turn his foot a little bit more towards the side, so again to emphasize this whole pose of rest that I want him to have. So all I'm really doing right now is just slightly turning his foot the other way. And instead of starting with the toes, I start by drawing the actual boot, so that the weight of the boot itself is what's turning the foot sideways. I know it may seem like a needless detail, but I thought, you know what, let me just add a little bit more detail on that. And now I'm thinking, what should this soldier have on his hand? I decided, you know what, I'm gonna make him hold a map. So he's probably just gone through a couple villages looking for German forces, and after a long day of fighting, or long 2 days of fighting, maybe he's finally found some rest, knowing that there's no enemy forces in the immediate area. So he's gonna sit down, relax, and just look at where to head next, maybe. This all becomes a layering process. Each layering process means that more detail will be given to it. Do not be afraid to erase what you do not need. So if a couple lines become irrelevant, then get rid of them. Some people do like to keep those lines. It does give a bit of character, I guess, but sometimes I do feel like keeping those lines, but there's other times where I feel that we don't need it. And right now I'm starting to add the clothes, so I'm starting with the collar on his shirt collar. In many cases, if you are unsure how certain objects should appear based on a certain time period, and you want to be accurate, you want to know exactly what sort of uniforms these people wore or what sort of weapons they had, there is no shame to Google it, to go onto Google Images. You can type M1 Grand on the search bar. The more you draw these uniforms and these weapons, the more familiar they will seem to you, and then next time you might not even need to Google it. It's such a great tool, Google, that is. It's really such a great tool to have. Accuracy, if that's what you're going for, that is a good way of making sure that accuracy is met. So I'm leaving his shirt like half tucked in and half out. Again, he's had a tough time since he landed in Europe, in Normandy, and God only knows what he's seen. So there was a bit of a jump here. So I had a bit of a technical error with my camera. What happened was the camera stopped running due to the batteries. It was really a good thing that I stopped to have a drink of water, and then I just looked over the camera to make sure it was still running, and then lo and behold it wasn't. So I just quickly changed the batteries and I continued drawing. So what you have missed, basically, I just added the eyes, all the facial details, and right now, as you can see, I'm still busy with the shadows and the shading. So don't worry, there will still be a lot of shading and a lot of detail to come. As an interesting bit of detail, I've added some bleeding coming from the top of the forehead down to his face, as well as on his elbow. So these guys are they are dragging themselves on the floor, they are hiding behind rubble, and scratches will definitely come. And then with explosions and shrapnel, things are bound to embed themselves into your skin. So I really wanted to translate that into this image. So going back to Google is a great tool. I use that in order to make sure that the details on the equipment belts around his waist is just as accurate as possible, as it actually meant to be. When it comes to the mapping itself, those details of the roads and the little towns, I do have a little bit of background in architecture, so I did rely on my knowledge to sort of make it appear legitimate. It's always a good idea to use an A4 or an A5 piece of paper you got lying around to shield your work from your grubby hands. Your hands will get grubby, especially if you would be doing a lot of smudging as well. Or even if you're not doing it, some graphite will obviously stick to your fingers. So if you use a piece of paper to shield the drawing you just did, so it is a good idea to use that piece of paper as a sort of protection. And anytime you can add shadows. In this case it would be underneath his forearm or maybe under the map. Make sure you have a good perception of your sun orientation, because you'll be using this direction onto all the other elements once you're done with your character himself. In this case, he is facing a southwesternly direction, and this is close to noon, maybe 12:12, 1 o'clock. So I'm envisioning it to be a summer day in Europe, maybe in some French village. The sun is high up. Just by looking at the way the sleeves of his shirt are all folding against one another, if you need a model for that, again, there's Google. Or you can actually do it yourself. Go grab one of your shirts, wear them, look in the mirror, and just bring them all up to a bunch. And just see how it looks. You can even take a photo of yourself doing that if you have no access to the internet. It's always good to get as much reference as possible. I've included a cigarette on his resting hand, and a little bit of cigarette smoke coming up. It's always a nice little detail. And I begin to first draw the shape and the form of the helmet, and the straps below the helmet and around it. And I do not need that line demarcating where the wall and the ground would meet. Once that's gone, I start to add more detail to it, a bit more shading, and looking at where we want the sun to be and where the shadows will be, we can begin to give more shape or more texture to this helmet. It's always good to use a bit of smudging, just evens out everything. This used to happen quite a bit in World War II. Really close calls. In fact, not only World War II, all the way to Vietnam. People used to get shot right in the head, but it never penetrated the helmet because the bullet wasn't coming at a 90-degree angle, so ricochet right off the helmet, but it would leave a dent right behind. Just quite a nice little detail I wanted to put in there. Again, this guy has been through a lot. His facial expression, I really wanted to convey hardship with low hanging eyes. So right now I begin to draw the rifle. I must confess, I am not an expert in weapons. I did have to use Google, and I did have to use a reference to know exactly what the M1 Garand looks like. And it was actually quite fun because it is quite an elegant rifle. I really wanted it to be accurate from the texture, which I will add later, for the grain of wood that travels from the back of the rifle to the front, to the shadings as well. And I also made sure that the rifle's proportions seemed realistic when it's standing right next to its owner. if you want to create a sort of like a sheen effect, like if the sun's reflection is hitting right on it, use your eraser. In this case I'm using my mechanical pencil's eraser, which is quite small and perfect for these tiny little details. Where you'd expect the sunlight to hit and create that streak of white light along the length of the rifle, that's where you would erase what you've just smudged with your finger. So it creates a nice little reflection onto it. Then you can add a couple dark lines around that little sheen area that you just created, so just for a little bit more of emphasis. Now right up here is where I begin to draw the blown part of the house. So what I'm imagining is that a Panzer probably just blew it off with the shell. And these lines that I'm busy drawing right now, I first begin with the plaster work that's been blown outward, and then the rubble below the hole. And then there's a cleared up spot right next to the hole where no rubble fell. That's where our character decides to sit down and take a rest. So as with everything, you begin with an outline. Thin lines. You don't need to really apply that much pressure into it. What's really cool about this detail as well, if knowing how construction works, whether the house is made out of blockwork or hardcore taken from site, you'll have the structure first, which some of it in this case is standing, but then in some of these cases you'll have that layer of plasterwork or stucco that's still standing, that has been blown away just yet. So, but it's a crackling shell that can fall apart at any time, but it's just plasterwork. So that's what I'm trying to convey in this case. And then you get these cracks running alongside. It just shows how weak that wall, or at least the plasterwork, is, that could just fall apart. I mean, there's no structure behind it. Now here I'm going to erase that line, that horizontal line between the wall and the ground, and again I'm outlining the details like little pieces of blockwork or stonework and maybe pieces of steel that just fell off the side with the explosion. And it's a combination of outlining and shading, outlining and shading. Let's say if you want to do thicker lines, that could be barbed wire, which I'll add some right now or in a couple of minutes. And in other lines, you know, with a bit of shading, again using the sun as your reference, you can just start to give form and shape and texture to what essentially is nothing but rubble, just dust and stone piled up on top of each other. So there's your barbed wire. So honestly, this can be seen in both ways. You could be sitting inside one of those homes, or you could be sitting outside. It really doesn't matter. If, like in this case, I chose not to put any sort of a finish to the wall or the flooring, I'll just leave it blank, albeit I will add a couple cracks, and there's a couple more things I want to add to this wall, but it's really up to the eye of the beholder where he wants it to be. So now for some really thick shading, I'll draw these thin lines to sort of plan where I want the shadow to go. And I begin shading immediately. And already you can start to see how much it differs from when I began drawing this rubble. It really starting to take shape. It's starting to look more realistic, more like a photograph. Although, don't expect for your drawings to be as perfect as a photograph. It'll never be the case, but you can get really close just by shading and texturing alone. Now I begin to draw the crack lines. As I've mentioned before, this stucco or this plaster is cracking all over the place because majority of it lost its structural integrity in the form of the block work and the stone work that used to make part of the wall. So these cracks would naturally travel from its weakest point down to the rest of the wall. So these are nice little details to give it that extra realism. Now up here I want to add something special. I want to add some bullet damage. Not as if they were targeting our character himself, but rather that, there was probably a gunfight, and this being near residence, someone will take cover behind this wall or in front of the wall, and someone will try to take shots at whoever's hiding there. And chances are somebody was in this exact same position where our character is, and they were probably shot at. So these are just telling the story of something that happened before, long before he was even here. So I begin by first drawing the bullet holes, and then the little crater that goes around each bullet hole. So the plaster gets damaged, of course, with the paint and everything else, and the structure behind the plaster gets exposed. The impact made by the bullets themselves would create these crack lines, and sometimes the plaster work would actually come off from these crack lines, as you will see, because then I'll just draw some of that plaster work that came off on the ground next to him. Just an added effect. Just very simple and light lines, just to indicate that. Just adding some debris from the bullet shots, from the bullet holes. And then I just highlight over where I've just been with a couple darker colors, just to emphasize its profile. Now I'm drawing the line work that will be part of the shadow that our character himself is making. Now you can exaggerate slightly on the character's profile on the wall, because shadows, depending on what time of the day it is, they'll never 100% look like the profile they're coming from on the man's body. So you can sort of twist them or warp the shadow to a realistic point, so it doesn't have to go like crazy everywhere. Just you have a little bit more of creative independence to what shape you want your shadow to be. But once you got that sorted, you start filling it in as black as you can with your graphite pencil or your mechanical pencil. Now you have to be quite careful around this face. Right at the border of his face and the wall itself, just make that line there extra thick or extra black, so that you know exactly where that is, because we will be touching this up with a black marker much later. And as you can see, it just looks completely different now. It looks a lot better. He doesn't look like he's floating in space, he looks like he belongs where he is. A couple of highlights on the hair as well. A little bit of shadow under the helmet. And the next thing is I'll do the same treatment I've done for him, but for the rifle. I'll also use this time to add a little bit more shading around his neck and around his chest. It's a little bit tricky because the rifle would have an inverted shape to its shadow than what it currently is, just because of how it's leaning up against the wall and how the sun is shining on top of it. So I'm just adding that shading again to the darker side of the rifle. And once I add the shadow of the rifle on the wall, you'll see it will blend in quite well with this. See, that's the beauty about using an HB pencil. It's not too brittle and it's not too hard. You can do so much with it. You can do very detailed, thin lines. You can do very thick shading if you're doing shadows like I am right now. Setting the shadow of the helmet. So now I start filling in the shadows. I'm just giving the shadows much more emphasis. and it will change the whole appearance of the drawing once it is done, and you'll see what I mean. So what I'll do with this thick marker, I first start by filling in the very center of the shadows, as far away from the edge of the shadows, because then that will just enable me to not make a mistake. Because then I'll go over the edge of the shadows with a thinner marker. In this case, I will, to be honest with you, you don't even need to use a thinner marker. You can just use a Fineliner pen. And a bit of an artistic liberty here. I'm going to touch up the blood on his head and on his elbow in red. I'll go over the edges of the shadows. Just so happens that sometimes when you go over graphite, your ink stops flowing. And a handy thing about having this piece of paper shielding your work is you can just go over it on clean paper, just so that you can clean up the tip of your pen, so the graphite doesn't clog the flow of the ink. Just doing the same thing all around his body. So remember when I did those extra thick lines around his face? So this is where you'd go over them, so you know exactly where the edge of your shadow is. Right now he actually looks a little bit like Christopher Walken's character in The Deer Hunter. I started this drawing from scratch. I honestly didn't have any idea which celebrity I wanted to represent as actor. It's just sometimes these things happen, you know. Once you start going just by imagination, you know, you'll end up sometimes creating a character that looks like someone you know from a movie or somewhere. It's probably your subconscious. So now with the Fineliner pen, a 0.1mm one, I can touch up around the lips, around the nose profile, around the eyebrows, adding as much detail as I can. And it does give that extra edge to your drawing. It will really make it uniquely beautiful. By adding those darker lines, you also add a bit more depth. So whether it's on the ears, whether it's on the hands, we can never get it to a level where it's as if you were standing next to him or so, but it just adds a little extra style as well. We can all go over the creases of his shirt. And there you go. We are done. So next what I will do, I will place a still image of the final drawing. Because video does not translate all the lines, all the shades and all the details clearly, I thought it best to take a photograph of the final drawing and place it in the video so you can see. And here it is. From this moment onwards, if you scan the image, you can go on to GIMP or Inkscape and you can edit the image as much as you want. You can vectorize it or you can create new filters for it. Right now, just very quickly, I tweaked the brightness and the contrast to come up with this image. Well, thank you very much for watching. Feel free to subscribe, like, and ring that bell if you want to be up to date to any new uploads. And don't forget, keep on sketching.